people want to know how many people are watching, and very often what sort of people, by age, by sex. And there are two sorts of people who want to know this information. One is the program makers and the broadcasters who want to know how popular a program is, if it's worth having a second series. And the other is the advertisers. As worldwide, well over £1 billion a year is spent on television advertising. So obviously people want to know what they're getting for their money. Television monitoring is done worldwide in most countries these days, and every country is different, has different requirements. There are in over 80% of the countries, there are just 3 companies that do the monitoring: Kantar Media, where I used to work, Nielsen, and GfK. There are countries where the work is done by independent local firms, but even there, usually they need to go to one of the big firms for the relevant software and hardware. And the way this works usually is that the television companies and the big advertising agencies form what's called a JIC, the Joint Industry Committee. And then they'll issue invitations to tender for the work, and then choose from among the bids that are submitted. And typically a contract will run for 5 years. And in my experience, usually the same company gets the renewal for quite some time. It's quite rare for a company to get changed. There are a few exceptions to this, mainly the USA, which is, of course, by far the world's largest market for television advertising. It accounts for very nearly half of all worldwide television advertising in terms of money paid. And then a company does the monitoring on its own initiative and sells the results. And this, usually an established company gets a monopoly on this, but sometimes you can have a new company setting up as a rival to the existing one. So how is monitoring done? Originally, it was done with paper and pencil. You were given a pad of forms to write down what you were watching. And then you had very sort of primitive monitoring, which produced huge reels of perforated paper strips which had to be analysed. But now it's done with electronic monitors. So you have a panel of households, and the panel is designed to be representative of the population, and the monitors record the sound of the program being watched. And then the monitoring company is recording the soundtracks of, in a large country, maybe hundreds of different channels, and it then tries to match what the monitor has picked up with the sounds that they've recorded. So that tells you what is on the television, assuming it's switched on. So you've also got to know who in the household is watching it, or whether there are any guests watching it. So there's the remote control. And the idea is that when you come into the room, or when you first switch on the television, you use the remote control to log in everybody who's in the room. And then if you leave the room while the television's on, you're supposed to log out. There is a problem that people don't necessarily always do that. I'll come to that in a bit later. And the first question people often ask is, how big should this panel of households be? And obviously, the bigger the panel, the better, but also the more expensive. So generally, the Joint Industry Committee that commissions the monitoring will say, we want a panel of 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 households. And as a general rule, Kantar Media advises that figures should only be published if they're based on at least 100 respondents. So the JIC has to think, what data are we likely to want? Are we going to want analysis by sex and 20 different age groups? And if so, is that for every channel or only for the ones where there's a large audience? And that should govern how large they think the panel should be. So the first step is we set up in setting up a new monitoring service, is to conduct what's called an establishment survey. It's a household survey, and with classical television monitoring, you only monitor people who live in households. You ignore people who are in hotels or prisons or communal establishments. That's perhaps less true for non-television monitoring if you're viewing on a tablet or somewhere, but we'll stick to households for the moment. And the survey should have at least 10 times as many responding households as they intend to have on the panel. So you collect data about the population, how many televisions have they got, what sort of reception, whether it's just a free-to-air or whether they've got cable or satellite. And it also gives a list of households of known properties, which will need to be sampled for the inclusion in the panel. And so you do it once before you set up the panel, and then there should be repeat surveys, and they should be at least annual, and ideally it should be continuous. I think for Kantar customers, only the United Kingdom has continuous field work. Some countries don't even manage to have a survey every year, but the more often and regular these surveys are done, the better. And there are two reasons for this. You need to monitor changes in the population. And that's particularly important with reception types, as it often changes significantly from year to year. So, for example, with cable television, in nearly every country, it's purely digital cable these days. But so it used to be a lot of analog cable, and obviously when the analog cable was switched off, that people would either switch to digital or they'd switch to some other method, so that would produce a sudden change. But there are other changes. For example, the proportion of people who live in single-person households has been rising steadily in many countries, and that's important to consider. And the other issue is that, well, I say you have a panel, for various reasons, which I'll come on to, you need to keep recruiting new households to the panel, so you need to keep getting a steady supply of new households to recruit. And problem we always have with the sample surveys is not everybody responds. The response rates vary tremendously from country to country, and they've been declining in many countries, particularly as a result of the SARS pandemic, the COVID pandemic. So non-respondents may differ from respondents. So you get non-response bias. And there's a standard technique to reduce this bias. You give every respondent a weight. And the idea is that if you take the, say, all males aged 20 to 24, and you add up all the weights for those people, the total should be equal to the number of males aged 20 to 24 in the population, as recorded by the National Statistical Office. Most countries produce annual estimates. There are a few that don't, that just have occasional censuses, in which case you may want to try and improve just using the census estimates by doing your own adjustments, but that's very difficult. So the data we usually use for doing this weighting are the population in households by age and sex, the number of people in households of different sizes. And the most widely used weighting procedure is what's called the random iterative method, or RIM weighting. It's been around since the early 1940s. And in 2016, I published a modified weighting procedure that I called asymmetric weighting. And I won't go into the details of how these two methods work today, because we're planning a meeting on weighting methods later in the year. But the advantage of my method is it produces a higher efficiency, which I'll explain later, and it reduces the number of very high weights. So we need the pen to be representative of the household population. And that means representative in terms of the amount of television watched in the household and the channel choice. So there are questions in the establishment survey on what we usually ask two questions. How many hours a day do you watch on a typical weekday, Monday to Friday? And how many on an average weekend day, Saturday or Sunday? That can vary slightly with different countries. So most countries have the Saturday and Sunday weekends. So we multiply the first figure by 5 and the second figure by 2. That gives you the average weekly viewing. And we then treat the claim viewing as a dependent variable, and we do some sort of regression analysis to see what variables best predict the total viewing. And some variables can be assumed to be important using common sense. If you've got 3 people in a household, then they collectively are going to be watching more television than if there's only one person in the household, for example. And the number of televisions, if your household's bothered to buy a second television, they're probably going to watch television more. But there are other ones that come in, and we can use, as I say, statistical techniques to decide what's important and what isn't. Channel choice, you can ask people what channels do you watch. That's very cumbersome, particularly in a country that's got hundreds of television channels. So broadly, we just do it by common sense. So the important factors are likely to be type of reception. Obviously, if you've got only free to air, you can't watch channels that are only available on satellite. The presence of children. If you don't have any young children in the household, you're unlikely to be watching children's television. And possibly region of the country. And many channels are only available in some parts of the country. And even if they're available countrywide, there may be particular issues that people watch more of the channel in some parts of the country than others. So from the establishment survey, for each control variable, we can calculate the proportion of households in each category of the variable. For example, if the panel size is 1,000, we find that 60% of households have 1 television, 30% have 2 televisions, and 10% have more. Then we know that the panel should contain 60% or 600 households, 30% or 300 with 2 televisions, and 10% with more than 2 televisions. Now, in practice, you're never going to find the panel exactly satisfies all the panel controls. So you need to check the panel frequently, ideally every day, to see if it's diverging significantly from what it should be, and to take action. And how much deviation from ideal is unacceptable? Well, for each category of each control, you calculate the tolerance, which is the square root of the control figure rounded up to the nearest integer. So if you require 600 households, then the square root of 600 is about 24.5. So the tolerance is rounding up 25. So if you have up to 600 plus 25, 625 households, that's fine. If you've got more than 625, you should remove some of these households from the panel. And if you have too few households, if you have fewer than 575, you need to recruit more. And you have to be careful if you start removing households, because you want the total size of the panel to be as close as possible to what it's supposed to be. And satisfying all the controls at once is quite a juggling act. Often satisfying one leads to problems with another. So you might say, oh, here's a household that we can recruit. We're short of one-person households. We're short of households with more than 2 televisions. So ideally, you should recruit a one-person household with 3 televisions. Such households may exist, but they're very rare. So you have to choose, do I recruit the one-person household or the 3 television household? And if you recruit both, is the panel getting too big? From a statistical point of view, too big a panel isn't a problem, but it does cost more, because you've got to get enough television monitors, and people on the panel are paid, rewarded in some way for being on the panel, so that also costs money. So when you're first setting up the panel, you have conflicting aims of choosing at random and getting a balanced panel. Because obviously, if it's not chosen at random, there's all sorts of biases that can creep in. And one way of doing it is known as the triplicate method. You sort the households in this arrangement survey so that consecutive households are as similar as possible. So you might say, right, we'll put all the one-person households, two-person households, three-person households in blocks. And then within the one-person households, we'll sort them by something else. So that 2 consecutive households are very likely to be identical or very similar. So you then split the list into 3 groups. You take 1 and then every third one, 1, 4, 7. Then you take 2, every 3, 2, 5, 8, and then the third and every third one, 3, 6, 9. So you take the first list and you try and recruit households from the first list. And it's very important that you make every reasonable effort to recruit. You don't just try and contact them once and again give up. You try and phone them different times of day, different days of the week. Perhaps you can email them, or it may be possible to do it by post, or even visiting them, but usually telephone's the best method. And then when you finally give up on, say, household number 13 from the first list, you then go to household number 14, which is the corresponding one on the second list. So it should be nearly identical to 13. So if you get 14 instead of 13, no big deal. And then if you can't get 14, you try 15. So you keep going until you've recruited maybe 2/3 of the panel purely at random. And you find that you're a long way off balance. So you then have to start picking and choosing more to get as close as possible to a panel balance. And then it gets very difficult to get the balance between random choice and arbitrary and quota sampling correct. So as well as panel controls, which refer to number of households on the panel, We also need to calculate universes. I'll explain that a little later. So while panel controls are proportions of the panel and are calculated from numbers of households, universes are absolute numbers and are calculated from numbers of people. So instead of finding what percentage of households have 2 televisions, we want to know how many thousands of people live in such households. It's an absolute number rather than proportion. Usually the variables for universes are all of the ones used for panel controls, plus age and sex, because obviously you can't talk about the age and sex of a household. So why do we need universes? So once the panel is set up, data are collected every day from all the panel households. And the panel isn't perfectly representative of what it should be. And also sometimes there are problems in getting data from some households. For example, you might find there's a power failure in somewhere, so households in that area are temporarily unavailable. Or there can be worse problems like typhoons or even earthquakes. So every day you have to do a weighting similar to the weighting of the establishment survey to remove the effect of problems like that. And the weighting procedure is very, very similar to the one for the establishment survey. It must be such that the sum of the weights of all the responses in a given group are equal to the universe for that group. And something that often comes up with clients is the efficiency of the panel. How far is the panel from perfect balance? And if the panel were perfectly balanced, then the daily weighting would be trivial, all the weights would be equal. And by a well-known result in sampling theory, the variance of the sampling error is proportional to the reciprocal of the panel size. So in practice, the panel isn't perfectly representative, so the weights aren't all equal, and the variance of the sampling error is greater than it would be if they were all equal. And there are several ways to define efficiency. And one way is to say that the effective size of the panel is the size of a smaller but perfectly balanced panel with the same variance of the sampling error as the actual panel. So then the efficiency is the effective size divided by the actual size. And it's quite easy to calculate the panel efficiency. If the mean weight is mu and the variance is sigma squared, then the efficiency is given by this formula. And if the efficiency is 1, then that implies that sigma squared is 0, so all the weights are the same. So the larger sigma squared is, the more weights that are very high or very low, the lower the efficiency. And that's one of the reasons I developed the asymmetric weighting technique. For the same set of respondents, it gives a slightly lower value of the variance. And so it slightly increases the efficiency. And it's essential to keep monitoring the panel. Households are likely to drop out for one reason or another, get fed up with doing it, or the data they supply seems to be unreliable. And even if a household remains on the panel, it can often change character. For example, you get a new married couple, so they're a 2-person household with no children. After a year or 2, they have a baby, so they suddenly become a 3-person household with a child. Eventually, if they stay on the panel long enough, the child will grow up and move out. So back to being a two-person household. But also, of course, maybe when they're first on the panel, they've been in their 20s. After they've been on the panel for a while, they'll be on their 30s, maybe their 40s. People might die, people might get divorced, all sorts of things happen. Also, every time you take a new establishment survey, you may find that the age distribution or the distribution of household sizes, or certainly the distribution of reception types, will have changed. So you've got to recalculate the panel controls in the universes. It's theoretically possible that one of the variables that you've been using for panel controls in universes is no longer considered relevant, or conversely that a new one is. Quite rare, but it's possible. So once you've altered the panel controls, you find that it used to be very good, fitting the panel controls. Now the panel controls have changed. It's not so good, so you need to remove or add people to improve the balance. So that's all I want to say for the moment. So we've got plenty of time for questions. Neil?
Hi, yes, Mike. That's very interesting. It's just just wondering, when you hear figures quoted for certain, viewerships of various programs, as someone who's operated in this in the past, do you have a skeptical view of the numbers, or are you or is this something you have confidence in that modern methods are appropriate, or do you think there might be some sort of gaming of the numbers in order for advertising revenue and so on?
Well, who is on the panel should be a very closely guarded secret. So you can't say you can't have the advertisers trying to bribe somebody to say, watch this program or don't watch this program. Nothing's perfect. There are sampling errors. You can estimate the sampling errors. There are problems that perhaps people are in the room but haven't logged in, or have left the room and haven't logged out. So it'll be very difficult to say, yes, the figures are accurate to within 1% or 10%, but I think generally, if you can say that a program's watched by 20 million people and another one's watched by 1 million people, that's a very real difference. One of the issues we have is that I was talking about the classical monitoring with on televisions where there's a physical monitor. Increasingly, people are watching on computers, and the easiest way to monitor that is you put a little bug on their router, so you know if they're watching a television channel. And some people don't like these bugs because they think, oh, we might get their bank details. But the bugs are specially configured so they can only detect a very limited number of websites that correspond to the television channels. And another problem you get with being on computers is that you have websites where you can watch old programs that perhaps going back quite some time, rather than just live programs. And actually, there's always been that problem to a certain extent with video recorders, that people would record a program perhaps while they're out and watch it later. So the first figures that are released every day are, assuming you data collected at 3 in the morning, is people who've watched that program either live or up to 3 in the morning the next morning. But the figures that people usually rely on are the 7-day figures, because you can, if you can't match the sound from a program to live viewing, you can search back through the collected sounds and find out if it's a program that's been broadcast in the last 7 days. In theory, you can go back further. There's a lot of computer work with modern computers. You can go back further. And the other thing about book viewing on computers is that they may not be at home. So the rule that you're only monitoring what's watched in private households does get a bit blurred for these other modes of viewing. And people even watch them on mobile phones. I'd hate to do that because you get some very tiny screen, and obviously you can watch on a mobile phone absolutely anywhere. Yeah, I will.
Hello. Yeah, sorry. Could you go over the mechanism again? You say that you have a sound a database of sounds.
Yes.
Is that what you said?
Yes.
I mean, really? So, I mean, if you've got 100 channels that you can listen to, you've got a database of sounds for the 100 channels, a complete database.
Yes. Well,
how do you get the database then?
You've got 100 recorders recording the sounds.
Okay, right.
It is a big operation. Yes, you need a big room full of these recorders.
Okay, fine. Well, I'm amazed. Thanks, then.
Yes, it's one of the big issues in television monitoring is the mushrooming in the number of channels. Was when we started in this country monitoring channels, there were precisely 2 channels, BBC and ITV. We reached channel number 5 in the early 1990s. So in 40 years, we went from 2 channels to 5 channels. In the last 30 years, we've gone from 5 channels to, I think it's 280 channels in Britain. And of course, some of them have very, very low audience figures. So I said we need to have at least 100 respondents to get a reasonable, reliable figure. So some of these channels, it might be that nobody on the panel watches them for a year. And so you just say, well, we can't tell you, or we can give you an upper bound. Some of them, you say, well, we will give you an annual figure, or maybe a monthly figure or a weekly figure for total viewing. Because although, as I say, we've got 280 channels, the 5 main channels account for over 80% of all television viewing. So you can imagine how small some of the smaller ones are.
Sorry, I'll start dominating conversation then. I'm interested. Your bugs on the routers. So presumably you're looking, for instance, a BBC iPlayer.
Yes.
And then you're able to pick up from the router which channel's being viewed.
Yes, because it's a different website.
Because it's got a unique URL for BBC 2 or what have you. So, okay. And so where's the problem in streaming then? Because presumably you can get a unique one for an old program as a unique URL. Does it, or does it not?
Yes, but the thing is that then you don't know who is watching. You only know that somebody is watching, or maybe more than one person. So the BBC knows, but with iPlayer, exactly what has been watched, but they don't know who by who. So we add value by telling them, allowing for multiple viewing, what the total viewing figure is, and also age and sex or whatever they want to know.
Yeah, okay, but you say you've got the problem you don't know. I mean, do anything more complicated, like assuming that people watching at 3 o'clock in the morning are likely to be young unemployed males, rather, or something like that, or people watching in mid morning are retired people.
No. We know who is in the household, and we should know if they're using the remote control correctly, which of the people in the household is watching.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I forgot. Yeah, you're getting that from their operation of the remote control. Yeah, I'm with you. Thanks.
Yes, probably the biggest cause of error is people not operating the remote control correctly. But you can check this to a certain extent. What we can do is phone up people at random and say, who's watching television at the moment? And then we can compare that with what they claim is the people watching according to their remote control. And on the whole, it's over 90% accurate. So it's not as big a cause of error as I must say I initially thought when I started doing this. Every country's got, as I said at the beginning, every country's got its own problems. In Britain, it's very, very easy to do these household surveys because you get list from the post office of every residential address, and from the ONS you get a classification of census output areas, so you can do very sophisticated stratified sampling. But it's very rare that not many countries are up to this. But the United Arab Emirates, for example, is an absolute nightmare because, for a start, the majority of the population are not Emiratis; they're guest workers who come and go quite rapidly. And there is absolutely no such thing as a list of addresses there. So the only way we could get that to do sampling was to virtually everybody's got a mobile phone there, so you just dial mobile phones at random and hope somebody answers. That's an extreme example, but there's every gradation between that and what we can do in this country. And there's all sorts of unexpected problems, like Turkey. As you probably know, the President of Turkey, Erdogan, is rather dictatorial and very worried about opposition. So there were 3 main television channels in Turkey when we started monitoring there, and after a while we found that the viewing figures for 2 of the channels were going down, and the third one going up. And the problem was the one that was going up was perceived by the government as being rather anti-government. So our staff in Turkey were accused of plotting with the opposition to rig the figures, and we spent an awful lot of time trying to convince the government that it just wasn't possible, that there were all these checks that were being done in this country to make sure that the figures weren't being rigged. And we started monitoring the viewing figures in this country very intensively to see if anything was going on. And suddenly the viewing figures for this 3rd channel collapsed. So I contacted the people in Turkey. I said, what's going on? They said, oh, the army's occupied the television station. And so people aren't very keen on watching this channel anymore because the army's controlling what programs are on. And eventually they closed that channel down. So that's an extreme example. I don't think that's ever happened anywhere else, but we obviously do monitor in loads of countries that are not nice democracies like this country. So we do have to be careful. David Hussey.
Hello, Michael. Thanks for the seminar. I'm afraid I managed to join very late. You might have seen my email from the RSS, but possibly not yet. First of all, I wondered if you could possibly share the slides.
Yes.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. And also, I have a question about non-response.
Yes.
So please bear in mind that I haven't seen much of your talk, unfortunately, but I was just interested in how falling response rates have affected TV audience measurement, and whether that's something that you think is affecting the accuracy of the measurements, and indeed what sort of response rates you're getting at the moment.
Well, there's two issues. One is three issues really. One is the when you see the slides, you'll see that the first thing we do is we do a big household survey to ascertain the characteristics of the population.
Yes, I'm aware of that. I know a
Yes.
little bit about the basics. So yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, and we weight the results of the survey to try and reduce the non-response bias. The response rates do vary tremendously from country to country, but they're all under 50%, and they sort of collapsed due to the COVID pandemic. They've recovered a lot since then. But yeah, yes, that's certainly one issue. And then there's the question of even if they respond to the establishment survey, can we get them onto the panel? And
yes,
again, there's a massive non-response bias there. That it's much more difficult to get one-person households full of young, consisting of a young person.
Right.
So again, we have to weight the results we get, the daily weight results we get from the panel to allow for that. I don't think that recruiting from the establishment survey to the panel has been as big a problem as getting people onto the establishment survey, but it is an issue. And if you say, well, how much is the remaining bias after you've weighted it, I really can't give you an answer. But it must be that if there's a higher non-response, that it goes up. Yes.
Of course. Yeah. And what's the response rate in the UK or GB now, roughly?
To the establishment survey.
The establishment survey, yeah.
I think it's the low 30s%.
Right. Which is presumably down from sort of 50 or so, is it?
Oh yes.
Pre-COVID, yes. Yeah. So quite typical of large-scale social surveys, yeah.
But one of the things about the establishment survey is we need to get a given number of respondents. So I said that the response is 10. Number of response we need is 10 times the panel size. So the panel size in this country is 7,000. So we need to get 70,000 households. So it's not like a government survey where they contact so many households and take whatever they get. We have to carry on trying to get more and more households. So we've got 70,000 respondents. So obviously a lower response rate increases the cost of doing the establishment survey.
Absolutely, and the establishment survey is it's used to top up the panel. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, but it's not used as the main recruitment method. Am I right?
No, it is in this country.
Oh, it is in this country. Okay.
Well, for the main one anyway, the Kantar's just started after I left doing a second survey, what's called the origin survey for different people, and that doesn't use the establishment survey for recruiting. But yes, for the main one, it is used.
Right. Thank you.
Any more? Oh, hi, Will again.
Well, sorry again. So you've thrown in a new factor then, the Origin survey that you mentioned before. What's that all about?
Well, I'm not very familiar with it because, as I say, it started after I retired. But it's basically for different customers who've got different needs. They're more concerned with multimedia data, so they want television and other media sources compiled on a systematic, uniform basis. Right. Well, thank you all very much for attending.